So, as I said, thank you so much for turning up. My name is Jonathan, or Johnny Clowes. I'm a senior manager at the Carbon Trust, working in our Ventures Innovations team and our Sustainable Development team. And I am really pleased to have Let's try that one. Really pleased to have a fantastic panel here of wonderful people to hopefully keep us engaged on our session around e-mobility and DRE, energizing the African mobility sector. As the mobility sector in Africa evolves, we have seen an explosion of electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers hitting the market. And it's fantastic to see this growth, but still with hundreds of millions of people without energy access, with a potential market that is viewed at 40 million EVs on the roads, we are a long way from hitting the kind of scale that this market has the potential for. And so what we really want to do today is try to unpick that, understand what's the financing we require, what's the business models we need, what's the enabling environment we need to really start to make this scale. And we're seeing so much of this in urban areas where there's a density of customers, where there's huge opportunity, but we also want to start to see this in rural areas as well. So we'll start to unpick some of that. Importantly, this isn't going to focus just on DRE and e-mobility, but as well, increasingly, we know that if we're to make these business models work, we need to improve the business model and the enabling environment for all of e-mobility so it can move towards those new sectors. And so again, that's some of the stuff we're going to move towards today. And whether that's talking about innovative financing, policy mechanisms, interoperability, or any of those things, we will start to cover some of those. This isn't easy. If this was easy, many of the people on this panel would be millionaires. Maybe you are. And we will have moved on and we wouldn't need to be sitting here. But we will try and cover a few of those things, and hopefully you'll have a few things to take away. So I have a fantastic panel of people here next to me, who I will very quickly introduce. We have Josh Well, who's the founder and CEO of Ampersand. We have Liesbet Mijlemans, close enough, okay, great. Africa Regional Officer for EDFI Management Company. We have Duke Benjamin, Energy and Climate Cluster Coordinator for GIZ in Nigeria. We have Celeste Vogel, who is CEO and co-founder of eWAKA Mobility. Ray Coyle, who is the CEO of Energise Africa, and Toukam Ngoufanke, pretty good, perfect, great, partner at Persistence Africa Climate Venture Building Fund. So, the way this is going to work, we're going to start with a sort of quick group discussion amongst us. We'll then move into a Q&A. We'll then have another, and we'll go into another Q&A. So start thinking about your questions. I want this to be engaging, and sensing that some of you might fall asleep, I'm just going to ask you all a quick question so that we can understand who's in the room. I'd like to understand, if you are an investor, put your hand up. Okay, one or two. If you are a DRE company, put your hand up. Okay. If you are a e-mobility company, put your hand up. And if you are a donor with lots of free money, or just a donor, put your hand up. A few. Perfect. Cool. So we've got a good mix in the room. Fantastic. So that's enough for me. This is meant to be interactive. So think about your questions, and let's jump in. So I want to start with the two e-mobility companies on the panel, just to kind of understand your views first. You don't work in an easy sector. There's a lot of complications that exist. And there's a lot of complications that also exist in the DRE sector, which would potentially make your business models even harder to manage. So I'd just like to start with you. So what do you see as the potential compatibility between the DRE sector and the e-mobility sector? And are you doing it? What might make it work for you?
Can you hear me? Thanks, Jonathan. Johnny. Yes, we run an e-mobility platform at the intersection of transportation and last mile logistics. We integrate locally assembled e-bikes, electric cargo bicycles, electric motorcycles, train and manage riders, aggregate demand, and monitor for uptime and performance of our fleet. And as you said, Johnny, we do not do DRE, but the primary reason for this is that We operate primarily in cities, and I've just started going into rural areas and also in Kenya. And in other countries, we are in Rwanda, and also now have started deploying in Burundi. And so for us, the primary question as I thought about DRE, because this has not really been on the table, is the question for us is when and why DRE, right? In Kenya, you look at the grid, and the grid is over 90% renewable energy. So it begs the question, when you look at that, does it make sense to go to the D, right? Because you've got the renewable energy piece. Then once you make that decision, in Kenya, in urban areas, you make the decision that you're going to look at the grid. The next question would be looking at EV rates, right? The EV tariffs in Kenya. You look at the price of it. Then the next question would be, over time, would your ROI be better and cheaper if you went D, right? And the third piece looking at this would be from an e-mobility company, which is already CapEx heavy, however way you cut it, whether you are on the vehicle side or on the infrastructure side or battery side, it's quite CapEx heavy. Question is, does it make sense to go CapEx heavy also on the infrastructure of the DRE side, right? So there are opportunities to partner. So when you look at Kenya, it hasn't made much sense for us. But when you look at a country like Burundi, on the other hand, which is 11% electrified, and that has a fuel problem, then it's a different question. And then the next question after that, even in places like Burundi, where you would probably work with a partner, you would ask yourself the question of utilization. Now, from a country like Burundi or Cameroon, where I'm from, where even though we produce a lot of energy, but a lot of electricity, but do not have a properly connected country, the question is, are you in densely populated areas or not? Now, Douala or Yaoundé, unlike Nairobi, are very densely populated areas where you have, in one city, you might have, I don't know, the numbers are not clear, but you might have 1 million bikes, right? Like, so in a place like that, that question of whether or not you should have DRE and it's a very sunny country as well, would also make sense because of the high utilization. But in a place like Burundi, the question is what kind of DRE, right? You would look at multi-purpose batteries might make more sense than infrastructure because again, you're looking at utilization. So I don't think it's a yes or no answer. I think it really is what are the conditions and whether or not it makes sense from an e-mobility point of view to support both CapEx heavy approaches.
Brilliant, thanks. Josh, over to you as well. And particularly on the finance side, and making the economics of it work out, which I think you had some points on.
Great, thanks. Hi everyone. So Josh Well, CEO, co-founder at Ampersand. So we were the first company operating with electric borders in Africa by about 2 years. Started in Kigali, where we currently have 6,500 motorcycles on the road, and here in Nairobi with about 2,500. So what the part that we do, and really where we see our core strength and growth is on the energy side, so providing the designing and deploying the batteries, renting those batteries out to riders on motorcycles and other vehicles. We currently have EBITDA positive. We're currently EBITDA positive. Have been for a couple of quarters, and expect that to continue on into the future. So that's an important, I think, proof point for a lot of investors that companies can operate profitably. More excitingly, I think the question you should ask is, well, what's the EBIT? What's the depreciation? That's on track to be positive by the end of the year. So we're very excited about that. Definitely for me, when I looked at Africa to start this business, the distributed renewable energy, pay-as-you-go solar, was a big part of the inspiration for me to start looking closer. It sort of made sense that, okay, now mobility is the next step up the energy ladder. But what I quickly found was that the grid is available. You don't have to tie up a lot of capex in places, and the unit economics operating in an urban environment are just easier. Kigali, within a 16-kilometer radius of the center of the city, there are about 40,000 commercial motorcycles operating 180 kilometers a day. So you can serve those customers with a very small footprint. Customers are very accessible. They're very clear on the cost savings from going electric, and information flows very quickly among those customers. We don't have to do any advertising. Our customers do that for us. And so we've been approached by probably 60 different mini-grid companies over the years across Africa, looking for productive use of energy. The challenge is twofold from a commercial perspective. The first is the cost of electricity. So the cost of electricity, when we are comparing against fuel, which is the primary value proposition for our customers, the cost of electricity makes up quite a large proportion of that cost stack. You've got obviously the battery capex, which you need to recoup that initial that investment. You've got charging infrastructure, staffing of that infrastructure, and you've got electricity. Those are the largest components. And so when we went down this road, we talked to these mini-grid companies, and we'd ask them, so what would need to be the cost of electricity that you would have to charge per kilowatt hour? And we were getting answers of 30 to 60 cents a kilowatt hour. At that rate, we just can't make the numbers work. I mean, we can get grid power for between 9 and 17 cents. It really takes it off the table. That appears to have changed, and I'm part of the reason I'm so glad to be at this conference is that trying to pick up more data points around this, but it sounds like we're sort of around 15, 17 cents, even for CNI rooftop solar. So if we're talking ground-mounted, larger scale, that part of the math seems to be solved. The other critical question then is what's the volume and the complexity? And for us, we have about 10,000 customers on the wait list in Nairobi. We've got another 4,000 or 5,000 in Kigali. The resale price of our motorbikes, there's so much demand that the resale price of our motorbikes after a year and a half is higher than the original sticker price because of the cost savings. I mean, right now it's crazy. It's 50% cheaper to ride an electric motorcycle than a fuel one. But even when prices are more tepid, fuel prices more tepid, it's still around 35–40%. And so as a business, it just doesn't make commercial sense for us to go into other places, especially because of the sort of dire lack of equity capital in this ecosystem. We just have to focus on much more on profitability a lot earlier than we normally would have to make that J-curve as shallow and as short as possible to where we're covering our own costs and don't have that fundraising risk ourselves. That said, because cash is so tight, we can be persuaded to actually go into more rural areas if there's additional capital that we can use in ways that also benefit the core business.
Thanks so much. Across those 2 points, with the kind of the challenge in terms of the business model and the logistics of making that work with the density of customers, and then on the finance side of things and the pressure that investors are going to put on companies, we have some investors to maybe talk about the pressures that maybe come down on top of them. So maybe Ray, over to you first. And in terms of what it is that you need to be seeing to ensuring that you're recouping the money that you're lending to these companies and those pressures, I guess it makes sense to stick where the opportunities are best, or is there another approach?
No, I think you're right. So I'm from Energise Africa. We provide debt funding for both DRE and EV. So they're both sectors that we're actively involved in. And I think the point you made is really important, that the grid in Kenya is 90% renewable. So what problem are we trying to solve here? Whereas if you look at the total fuel use in Kenya, it's 18%. Because if you take into account, 18% renewable. if you take into account transport, cooking, and everything else. So the best way that we can improve that number is to get more people on EVs. So that should be the motivating factor, is getting more EVs rolled out. And we would, as a funder, to see the businesses we're investing in pursuing that pretty relentlessly. So you're going to start in urban, and then you're going to go out rural. I think there's a different question to... Sorry, ropey microphone. There is a different question to ask, which I think Josh was alluding to, which is that if we build mini-grids and we provide renewable energy in a rural environment, how do we then do that in such a way to enable people to get the benefits of electric vehicles? And that is more challenging because if you've got a rural environment, working out your charging infrastructure and, as you say, on the pricing of the electricity is more challenging. But I think that's a more realistic goal to set ourselves, is that once you start to reach, not saturation point, but you start to reach a really good penetration in the urban areas, then going out to rural and looking at DRE environments and trying to build models so that EVs are attractive in those environments, I think is a worthwhile aim. But at this moment in time, the EV companies need to scale. And scaling has to be the priority, rather than trying to do more innovative rural business models.
That's right. And Liesbet, to your end, in terms of financing these companies, could you finance them to do something else, or is it that case of, again, pressures from above?
Yeah, also just thank you. Quick introduction, Liesbet Mijlemans from ElectriFI. We invest debt and equity also both into DRE and into EV companies and a bunch of other business models. And I guess the question is, am I wearing my hat as DRE investor or as EV investor? I think yes, from the point of view of DRE investors and companies having a fleet of motorbikes attached as an anchor load to the mini-grid, it makes a lot of sense, and it could improve those financials. But at the same time, I think from the point of view of the EV companies, as been mentioned, this is already such a complex model to roll out. There's a lot of complexities here. I think also from the point of view of investors, probably EV is one of the most exciting investment opportunities out there. At the same time, also one of the most unknown and therefore most scary investment models in terms of technology risk, at least initially. In terms of a market risk, that's very different from what we're used to see in the DRE or access to energy market, with a market where the demand is very clear, but there's a lot of competition and potentially even external competition. And what will that market look like? Nobody really questions whether the market will be there, whether the demand will be there, but who will be the leading players and how will that exactly evolve. And I think given all of that, adding to that the additional complexities of not going where the demand is highest and where the deployment is easiest doesn't really make any sense at this point in time.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And so that case then around, it's potentially going to be a different business model. It's going to potentially be a very different financial incentives of the things that happen in areas that require DRE, or we're particularly sort of thinking on rural settings. Toukam, maybe over to you, just in terms of persistent with your venture building hat on, thinking about how you're building these potentially really strong companies of the future that are able to integrate with DRE and in e-mobility in an effective way. Just be interested to see, how do you then see that those future companies being built, or the support going to existing companies to actually move into these types of models that might be needed that integrate both of these things?
No, thanks for the question. I mean, I think there's sort of two parts, I guess, a bit of an answer, right? We typically invest very early, right? And so I think we would prefer to start when the company, the idea is still playing out, right? And I would say right now, there aren't a ton of those, right? I think if I kind of think back over the last, 5-6 years, there's been one opportunity, and all of them, I think one or two, all were rural, right? So the point I think they've made around it's a bit of what I would call last mile cost, right? That it's much higher in rural contexts, and hence perhaps why you're not seeing as much there. And the ones we saw then, just a bit on what Josh raised, economics around the cost of electricity, that even the ones we saw there, it was often challenging because, the cost of electricity needed to make it work was higher than what you could get somewhere else. And that comes in, I think that's where maybe some regulatory and maybe some technological innovation is helpful. That if you, in that case, then have a technology that can give you a longer lifespan, right? Because today, a lot of batteries in market are doing, I don't know, depending on the chemistry, you're saying maybe 2,500, 3,500 cycles. But if you can, for the same price, get a battery that gives you a much longer lifespan, then it can improve your economics, even if your tariff hasn't changed, right? But that, again, that's kind of a bit of innovation that would take time. What we've tended to see in terms of opportunity, where we've tried to be helpful as well, but it's tough, is, it's a bit more of a bolt-on model, right? It's either you restarted an EV company, then you want to add DRE, or you are a DRE company and you need to make things work and you're bolting on energy, right? That is often complicated for us because as an equity investor, I'm trying to invest in one thing. Like I don't usually have the flexibility to say, oh, let me invest in just the EV business, right? I don't have, so that means when you're bolting on, it complicates things for me because then I then have to worry about two things. I have to start worrying about, do both make sense, right? Am I investing, right? Or does just only one make sense sort of things? I think that's where it complicates. But, I would say the big area I see again is just that helping some of these companies where we've tried to think about just, does the technology at your disposal today make sense for the business you're trying to build, right? Because I think, unfortunately, in the long run, it catches up, right? But I see opportunity in rural areas because, I think this morning we were on a panel, right, Josh, discussion where, and I think what I've seen rather interestingly is, even in Kenya, when I looked at census data on assets, I think 70% of motorcycles are outside of urban areas. But the problem is the last mile thing, right? When I did the density, it was horrible in those, right? So there needs to be innovation around, how do you deal with that last mile cost in addition to just the fundamental fact that your DREs in those contexts where there is opportunity, at least from a number point of view, are challenging because by definition, government tends to push, your mini grids out to those places, and then, I'm sorry to say, but because you need to win elections, right? Things need to be priced a certain way, right? And so, I think those things make it complicated for me, right? And then the last bit that I tend to try to figure out what to do with is the regulatory uncertainty, right? That you read a lot about governments are doing, disincentives and disincentive, but, when you talk to actual companies, half of the time it's not there, it's a fight to get it, right? And if, especially in this sort of context, right, of sort of DRE plus e-mobility, let's say, I'd see mostly in rural context, you need that sort of regulatory certainty, whether it's incentives and stuff, and if it's not there, then it makes it difficult for me as an investor, sort of like look at it, even from a venture building perspective, with the seriousness it might deserve.
Brilliant, thanks for that. And I think from there you sort of see the challenge that exists with just the last mile and the environment that needs to be put in place. And so, Duke, maybe over to you. Nigeria has one of the most vibrant DRE sectors. It has what is considered a relatively positive enabling environment for the rollout of mini-grids in rural areas, and things are accelerating really quickly. But what's that next step then that needs to be taken around the enabling environment to support DRE and e-mobility rollout in those rural areas, so that maybe it is a case of we need to put new instruments and new incentives in place that we really are ensuring get out there, so that we're increasing impact in those places and we're not treating them as fully commercial models, maybe?
Yeah, thank you, Johnny. I work for GIZ, as most of you know, so basically I don't need to introduce GIZ, hopefully, but I work in Nigeria, and let me say a few things about Nigeria with regards to your question, Johnny. Following the conversation now, I have some question marks for myself, also from the conversation. I'm wondering if the crowd has the same questions, like what is the definition of a mini-grid, how small, how big it is, where is it exactly located? But let me say a little bit of what we've done in Nigeria as GIZ through one of our projects called Nigeria Energy Support Program, supporting Nigeria. The DRE story goes long way back with a mini-grid regulation that manages both on the grid and off the grid. So in Nigeria, on the grid, they call it interconnected mini-grids, so to say, and off the grid in the rural areas. But back then, classically, what we do as GIZ is enabling the environment or creating a market, starting with policies and regulation, then working with the private sector on pilot projects, which is a standard thing, and then building capacity and starting also part of the financing or de-risking or rather subsidies around making sure that the final kilowatt hour in those rural areas are brought down because of the infrastructure. So coming to Josh's question about the cost of electricity in those areas, one thing that came to my mind then is as of today, at least in Nigeria, where they have more than 200 mini-grids, most of them are located in areas where they are serving thousands of people. So the choice of mini-grid in rural areas is majorly where there is also economic activity, so that the PUE can be activated. And that's how we came into, let's say, in about 7 years ago, a company called Max in Nigeria. If most of us remember, the mini-grid business, at least from my point of view, is usually still based on subsidies or grants, right? And that had as a result that maybe sometimes there is too much over-dimensioning of mini-grids. So I think at the beginning we all struggled with PUE so that we can make the mini-grid plans work well, and that's where the likes of EVs came in. Fast forward today, we are doing the same thing we've done for DRE for EVs, working with the Nigerian government, working on standards, so to say, policy and regulation with the Standards Organization of Nigeria and the Nigeria Automobile Design and Development Council, Automotive, sorry, and they are working on trying to make sure the framework for EVs are in country. Now, coming back to DRE, because that's also a question I want to throw in the room, interconnecting it to EVs. If most of the mini-grids that at least I know in Nigeria in very, I would say, economic activity locations, and even the Rural Electrification Agency is now moving to interconnected mini-grids more so, which means the underserved areas and the urban areas, I still see a very good potential as EVs being well thought together with DRE. The problem, of course, I understand what Toukam mentioned is it easy to see the business case together or not, right? It could still be complementary, but the locations, that's where we also come in as GIZ with the funding partners, either German government or EU or whoever is funding, usually brings in the grant component to reduce the kilowatt hour. And I think at that point, it should be, again, perhaps a bit attractive for the companies. What do you think?
Josh, do you want to come back on that?
Tell me more.
Thank you. So basically, I feel that I took away from your from this discussion now. You said 9 kilowatt per hour to 17 is the range where it's no longer attractive or attractive, where it's good. So you know that most, at least in Nigeria, we are around 15 cents per kilowatt hour currently, $0.00 if we use. So basically, if this is the range you need to get in, The business case should be, that's where also the finance institutions come in at the end, what will be the delta that is required for you to get into this range? And then, how attractive, you mentioned 40,000, 30,000 bikes on the streets and co. How attractive has the location to be for you to come into the market? And I think if we have those economics, it is easier to pilot the locations, because even in Nigeria, on the DRE, mini grids, interconnected or not, we are doing site assessment with the Nigerian government for specific locations for pipeline deployment of mini grid projects. And the specifics are usually a number of minimum thousands, or let's say 6, 7, 8,000, 10,000, 20,000 people cohabit there. Then we have business activities of different ranges, and then mini grids are also deployed in a way that they serve maybe first is a small portion of those people, and then later on it can increase.
So the challenge for us when we look at Nigeria, I mean, Nigeria has I can't remember the numbers, 6 million, 8 million motorcycles operating, Okadas, and that's even with the ban in Lagos. So it's a huge market. It seems like cost of electricity is down where it needs to get to. The problem is that the cost of fuel is still very high, and it's tripled, I think, since the new government came in, and it's clear that there's only so far that it can, and so far and so fast that it can move in a short time frame. So at 80 cents a liter of petrol, and this is, I think it was 84 cents, but right now, but anyway. I mean, the markets that are in the sweet spot for us all tend to fall around $1.10, $1.20 plus per liter of petrol, because fundamentally our business model is apples to apples against bodas. I suppose if you're including other components in the energy package that have a higher value to kilowatt hour ratio, things like clean cooking, charging phones as part of a broader package that are reliant on that battery, maybe the math can flip that way, but obviously that's more complicated, and I wouldn't say that we have the bandwidth to look at that in depth. I mean, it's just because of the technology we've built and the track record we've built, we have so many offers now from even outside of Africa where equity capital is far more abundant, and that when we lay out the buffet of choices for future expansion, yeah, it's tough for Nigeria to compete, if I'm being brutally honest.
So what I'm taking from this is it's doable, it's hard, it's going to be very isolated in certain pockets and clusters, and it's probably going to be quite slow to start to roll this out into different areas. And maybe it is that we start to need, these new companies, these new business models, these new approaches coming in. In terms of, and this is open to the whole panel before we start to think about some audience questions as well, in terms of each of your roles to play in trying to form some of those partnerships to make some of these things happen, what can we be doing to kind of blend capital in a different way so that we're starting to encourage companies to go out to different places? We've had huge numbers of discussions during this week about results-based financing as incentives to move into difficult-to-reach markets for solar home systems or mini-grids, but I don't hear the same discussions in the e-mobility sector. But what are some of the, from your guys' perspective, things that we could be doing to be then encouraging organizations to take advantage of some of the opportunities out there, which are few and far between, but are potentially out there?
Well, one thing that might sort of dovetail there, I think the audiovisual team has kindly highlighted the value of having reliable batteries. I promise I didn't put them up to that. One thing where it dovetails is, so for us, as we look at the fragmented markets across Africa, in very diverse contexts, different markets, For us, franchising is a big part of the strategy. So we've de-risked the technology. We've got 7 years of track record on the batteries. I can show you what a battery cohort of hundreds of batteries from 36 months ago, 99% of this is still operating and on the road. So very different from a lot of the other companies out there. Without naming names, I think you probably know a couple that I'm talking about, where we've got customers waiting for 2 hours for battery swaps and so on. But I think we've passed that threshold. We've shown that the business works, that it's profitable, that the customers want it with the wait lists. But to scale out operationally, knowing what we know, we also know what we don't know, and when we're looking at different contexts. So thinking of other markets and contexts, we're looking at franchising. So we're using Ampersand batteries. We can teach everyone everything they need to know about the protocols. We can map and model how much revenue and where the stations need to be and how many sockets need to be where, and so on, and work with companies that want to deploy in those markets, together with companies that want to manufacture motorcycles or other vehicles for those contexts, and we can work to fast track their R&D process as well. So that might be an area where there's interest, where for us it's a relatively simple proposition where you can sell batteries. It's more light touch. It's not operationally involved for us. So we have an offtake and we learn from it, and kind of everybody wins. That might be part of the solution. So yeah, incentives and support and financing tailored to franchising structures. We're just ideating here, guys. Yeah.
I think the question about RBFs is an interesting one. We provide debt funding against RBF agreements, and we are seeing RBF grants now becoming more common for EV, which I think is a very positive sign. I think that that's needed. In the vast majority of developed countries, there are subsidies to encourage people to move to EVs. The idea that it's going to happen across Africa without the same subsidies that you need in Europe and in the US, well, not in the US anymore, obviously, but I think obviously those kind of subsidies are required. We are also seeing some mini-grid RBF grants, including PUE equipment and also including EVs, often in very small numbers. Which, to be honest, we struggle with a bit, because part of the funding process for a mini-grid is the community engagement and trying to understand what it is that the people in the community want and what they want to use their electricity for. And when we look at those community engagement projects, we're not seeing rural people saying, we want EVs. We get lots of mentions of refrigeration and milling and water pumping and electrical equipment, but we're not seeing EVs come through. Liesbet, interested if that's also your experience in terms of funding DRE. But we've got to go with what people want and what the demand is, and not think we can decide what it is. And then when there is the demand, I think it is important that there are those RBF-type subsidies in order to make what is essentially a new and difficult sometimes technology more affordable from a capital perspective, as is happening in huge numbers of countries.
Yeah, just to add on that, and I think I agree that that is not the question, or that is not the main PUE that we see being required in any of the service or in the mini-grids that we operate in, at least not the mini-grids, the rural mini-grids. I think it might be different also to your point that if we start looking at some of these interconnected mini-grids, at some of the metro grids where customer behavior is much more urban or urban-like, and I think that changes the story, but also it would change the value or the interest for you as an EV company, because in those areas penetration would also be high, and pricing would be, or economics would be attractive. That being said, the other point is also, we probably need to think carefully, why do we want to find ways to fund this? Is this because we think, as I said, EV is a very good anchor load for mini-grids, and it sounds like the right idea. That's probably not the main driver for this. It should come from the surveys, from the people, and from the needs. And I wouldn't be surprised that after all of those first needs are met, EV will be coming up. One of the things that was interesting also in the discussion that we had this morning is that one of the companies mentioned that actually in rural areas, the dependency on motorcycles is even higher than in urban areas. And so the use case definitely is there. It's just in terms of electrification, not their first priority, but the use case is there, the utilization is there, and that's also what will make it interesting at some point for the EV companies, I would say.
Great. Before I throw it over to the audience, Duke, you kind of nodded along and then pulled a little face halfway through that. Maybe encourage you to respond.
Problem. Let me try again. I think one thought that came up is, first of all, will be reasonable for us to think it in a way that maybe it is, let me start differently, politically correct. I mean, all this while it's been climate targets and co-driving EVs, right? At the moment we are seeing that EVs are becoming a factor of economic resilience. I don't know how many is following currently what is happening in the world, and the companies that have already gone to electrify their fleets are the ones that are currently enjoying the crisis we have in the world. So, and people are beginning to rethink it, and I think that we should start looking at it from that angle as well, that it's a sort of economic resilience, right? And work towards if the world is currently also shifting a little bit from the climate targets in general, like geopolitics is changing a bit, but this is something that is clearly currently feasible. So it's not as if it's something in the future. The likes of Josh have businesses that are going on and it's not based on grants. So it means that it is possible. So, and I believe then in order to scale it, we should look at clearly how we want to reduce the technical risks, the market risks, and financial risks. And usually that's where we as GIZ come in, but of course working with all the partners. So the question would be, asking in the round to what needs to change technically. I've understood in one way or the other that we need to increase the pipelines. We need to do bigger tickets and so on. But how do the others see it? What should we do technically? What should we do to drive the market? And what can we do financially for the financial institutions? What do we need to do when we are supported the likes of George and the governments that we work with to make it more attractive to you, and so that we can move forward? Because from my point of view, it is possible.
Toukam, on that, for the audience, what do you need? How can we help you to help the companies?
I think two things. I think one is, I think incentives, right? But I'd say more incentive with collaboration. And what I mean by that is what I've seen, and I having a conversation earlier with somebody, is that sometimes RBF/grants tend to be disconnected from commercials, right? And so what that then does is that you have, especially early stage companies, aren't solved the risking for future funding. They are, they're trying to make money by deploying so that they get the RBFs, right? Which, in a way it's okay from the RBF provider's point of view because you have numbers to report. But for myself as commercial, sort of at least equity impact investor, it's a bit tougher because, unless those RBFs are going to be there forever, right? When those, the tap is turned off, then it's a bit more challenging for me, right? I think two is, grants as well, or, incentives to support innovation, right? Because I think that in a rural context, probably like a swapping model won't work. because you have this infrastructure, you need to recover the cost. That means on your base sort of electricity costs, right? You need to, what you're charging, you need to mark it up so that you can recover, right, the cost of the technology, which is the battery, right, on top of the electricity cost itself. So there needs to be, I think, innovation, perhaps funding for that. That's sort of where I come in a bit, but grants could be helpful in that, to sort of look at, is it a model more where it's just, I don't know, right? Like if you have a mini grid provider providing connectivity at home and it's the right kind of quality, right? It's put in a way knowing that, look, this can also do mobility, right? Because I think there is a world in which it could work. I think it just means that there needs to be innovation, but innovation means money, right? And I can provide some of that, but I can't provide, right? Like I'm not given money to just pay for innovation, right? I'm given money to pay for some of that, but as well to, right, think ahead around, when does this company become something somebody else can kind of come in to support.
Brilliant. And then Celeste, in terms then, we've got people talking about potential incentives and the money to move into to do interesting things in these markets. Almost coming back full circle to your point at the start about the different markets and how Burundi is very different. And what incentives do you need to break these new markets where DRE enabled e-mobility or connected e-mobility might be something that you would want to grow?
Just picking up on where Toukam left off, we chose a more rider-centric, flexible charging approach to this, and I agree that in rural areas, but also in depending a little bit on the use case for which e-mobility is attractive, swapping does not answer all questions, right? And so in terms of incentives, I think it would be, when we first started, everyone was, most investors were pushing the swapping model. They're like, well, why aren't you swapping? And one question in my mind, and I actually travel to places where swapping is being done today in some very restricted context, I have not actually seen a successful swapping model across the board, neither in China, nor in Taiwan, nor in India, right? And so it begs the question, when is, again, like with DRE, when is swapping attractive and when is flexible charging, home charging, public charging a better approach? So incentives around exploring some of these opportunities in different areas would be good. And maybe one more point about what comes first, right? Like we took a very rider-centric kind of like aggregating demand to create work for our riders. So utilization of the vehicles is actually what actually drives the need for powering the batteries and not the other way around. And so the question, we don't get questions from our riders, am I charging on decentralized renewable energy or am I charging on the grid? The question is, do I have work and how am I gonna, get that done? And so I think incentives around actually looking at the data in terms of what are people actually doing and designing around the lives of people and not sort of driving people into a model that is attractive to investors because of the recurring revenue model. Then you see later that, meeting the CapEx requirements and ROI is actually harder to do than one thought in the beginning, yeah.
Yeah, Josh.
So on the home charging question, something we've looked at, we've run pilots with, and what we've found is that there are a couple of challenges with it. One is the upfront cost per rider, because when you go to people's homes so in Kigali, most motor riders have their own home where they can get a motorcycle to. The challenge is that they will typically park the motorcycle either right next to the house or in most cases inside the living room at night for security, to keep it clean, and this is where the children are sleeping. So there's usually 2-room homes, The wiring in the home, there's power running on the neutral phase, it's not earthed, the power for the house is just not, it's just that the risk of hurting somebody is just something we don't want to take. It's part of the reason we use LFP batteries, and we were the first company in the world to build an electric motorcycle using LFP, because this context is very, very different from China, India, Taiwan, and so on, because it's a purely commercial market and it's very, very high intensity. So the customers that we serve, what we're solving for is reliability, uptime, OPEX cost per kilometer. So it's much more like think of it more like a diesel truck than a consumer vehicle. China has now banned home charging because of these safety concerns, because so many hundreds of fires, tens of thousands of fires, hundreds, thousands of fatalities. India has also been very restrictive on home charging. And what we found was that, we had a lot of calls from riders who were very keen on home charging in the early days. But when we laid out the costs for them, it was clear that the solution was building more swap stations. And someone told me once that if you look back in history at the early days of the internal combustion engine, right, say 1910, cars are running on kerosene. The Ford Model T is still kind of in the early days. And there were no petrol stations around. Around 1910, you would have to go to a hardware store to buy fuel. So the rich people who could afford to buy cars would, also buy a few cans and then stockpile some at home. But by about mid-1920s, petrol stations were all over America. And unless you were a farmer in a very remote area, you would just buy fuel at the petrol station. And we found exactly that following a much faster timeline in Kigali. We receive very few calls now, requests for home charging. Home charging is also, it's a nice safety net. If batteries are not reliable, if your swap infrastructure is not reliable, it's a bit of a backup, insurance policy, like the power bank, we bring to a conference because we can't plug it in everywhere, plug the phone in everywhere. But if you're running a network, our swap wait times per day, each rider is spending about 10 minutes a day. Now for Spiro, ArcRide, their customers recently have been spending between an hour and 2 hours a day waiting for swaps because of various reasons I won't go into. But if I was one of those customers, I'd want a home charger so that I could have that, at least can carry it around and plug it in somewhere as an insurance policy. So I think quality replaces a lot of the need for that. And frankly, I think the safety considerations have to be taken very, very seriously, especially as we scale things up. Every time someone plugs in that battery at home, you're rolling the dice again. And it only takes, killing a few children in a horrific fire for the regulations and standards to come crashing down on this whole sector.
So just maybe a couple points. Again, like with the DRE versus grid distinction, I think it's not one or the other, right? You've seen, and to your point about innovation, right? We can see swapping models working like you do in places like Shenzhen or Bangalore, or places where there's high density and high frequency and high utilization of the bikes. You can see swapping being a very good idea in very dense corridors. In a city like Nairobi that is like super widespread, the capex involved in being able to meet what to me would, we've done the math, would be closer to 5, 6, 7 batteries to one bike than 1 or 2. So that's something that can work in certain situations. On the other hand, home charging is the other extreme. That works well in countries like, for example, Switzerland, Germany, places like that, where you have very reliable wirings and all of that. I agree with that. But there is a middle ground somewhere where innovation would be, would be useful to, use RBFs and other types of incentives to look at the possibility of public charging. You've seen that in China, for example, swapping is only done in very dense corridors, but actually public charging and charging infrastructure where you can actually, with your own charger and your own battery, charge. This is something that has been explored, and it's what you see, right? And so I think for the African context, forcing a very nascent market into one direction when you've seen over the last 30, 40 years that there's been an evolution, not only in technology, but also in structures around how to make the EVs available. I think it would be a little too early and it would be damaging to the market. And I think there needs to be flexibility. It's not one size fits all, and certainly should not be in a market like Africa, which is a continent with 54 countries and multiple cultures around that, right?
So just very, very quick response. So we run a 0.38 ratio of batteries to motorcycles. The threshold for building out a viable charging infrastructure in a city like Nairobi in terms of CapEx needs about $4 million to hit positive gross margins after depreciation. Kigali, Kampala, it's significantly less than that. So that's including the cost of all the batteries. I think the public charge, the problem with the beauty of the Africa market is the intensive utilization of the asset. But if you are restricting people to having to charge at home or carry a charger and wait, you are cutting into their top line revenue. Customers who can go get fuel in 2 minutes 3 minutes at a petrol station are not going to stand for that. And you have to be able to keep moving. Otherwise, you're cutting into people's top line. You're making them sit around for 2-3 hours a day waiting for charging. So for the high energy, high mileage use case, which is where the economics are the most attractive, 100 kilometers a day, 230 plus kilometers a day, which is what we see, you need to be able to keep people moving. And the other thing is with a battery swap, because we only need 1.38 batteries per motorcycle, those batteries are pretty much all the time either charging, which takes about 1 hour and 20 minutes, or they're out there working and making somebody money. So that the payback period on that battery asset, which still makes about, for most companies, about 60-70% of CapEx, the payback period of that is about 18 months. And then it continues working for a total of 5 years. And so your ROI, your IRR, your MOIC, whichever metric you want to look at it with, is phenomenal. And you can benchmark that off of India, Latin America. We're about 3 times, our unit economics are about 3 times better than any comps abroad for, we've raised $100 million and they're still not EBIT positive.
It's nice when you're moderating and you get disagreements on the panel and lots of conversations. I'm conscious on time, but I didn't want to stop any of this conversation. Celeste, you mentioned innovation. And one of the topics that we sort of discussed before this, and it's interlinked with innovation, is around interoperability in the sector, which is a hot topic right now. I think investors versus ecosystem players versus governments versus companies all have very different views on this. So maybe to try and throw a bit of kind of confusion in, maybe it would start with the investors, I think, just from their side of things. What's your view on interoperability? Is it required for the sector for it to really grow and mean you have more investable deals?
I think from our perspective as an investor, I don't think that EV companies should be basing their business models on what suits investors. EV companies should be basing their business models on what will build them really successful businesses and keep their customers happy. It would be obviously much more convenient for us as an investor if there was a single homogeneous technology, and it would make it much easier to invest in businesses. But this is a rapidly innovating area, and it needs to, as you were saying earlier, Celeste, there are innovations needed, there are innovations coming, and there's a real danger in pushing toward interoperability and losing that innovation and losing that pace of change. But I don't think it's a black and white question. There are steps. So Rome in Nairobi has introduced a Type 6 cable charger. which can charge multiple different types of EV. There are things that can be done. There is collaboration between different EV manufacturers and companies, but I think it's really, really important that we don't stifle innovation, because this sector needs more of it.
I agree. There's not much more to add. I totally agree that, one of the things that, in my sort of shoe as an equity investor, I try to look at is, what you'd call, competitive advantage, right? I think if we're not careful, you can start innovation that differentiates people, right, and businesses from one another. I think it's a bit of, the way I always put it is, when we talk a lot about, the environmental impact, right? It's a side benefit, right? This, like, if there was this homogenization, it would be a side benefit. It wouldn't be, because when a rider wakes up in the morning, and they're looking for a bike, right? Whether it's from eWAKA or Ampersand, they're not thinking that morning, my God, what am I doing this morning for an environment? It's like, it's how much money am I making, right? And so it's not to say it's not important, right? But that it's a bit of a side thing, right? The same with this, that, in a perfect world, some kind of homogenization be interesting, maybe, right? But that's not the reality, right? At the end of the day, it's really around, is it making sense for the people that is being deployed for, right? That's the market's verdict, right? That if not, it ends up being that you're building really to make our lives easy, which that often doesn't work out well. I've seen it play out before.
So just one more point on the interoperability question. I meant to mention that there is actually quite a lot. So lots of African manufactured EVs have lots of compatible parts with Bajaj, for example. So you can use brakes and tires and wheels and forks and springs and shocks and all that kind of stuff from other bike manufacturers. So I think there is a lot of really, really important interoperability that matters to the riders, because they want to know that when the brakes fail, that they can go to the local mechanic and get it fixed really quickly. The question really is more around the battery and the BMS, where the really important technology is and where the innovation is happening. So I think we shouldn't do this sector down by saying there isn't interoperability, because I think there is a lot. But it's very difficult to have interoperability in battery and BMS when you're trying to rapidly innovate those technologies.
If I may just, when you ask the question, like, is this something to do for investors? Probably not. At the same time, if then it is sometimes harder to raise money, it is also a fact that we need to accept that this is a risk for investors that they need to find a way to deal with, and it might be harder to raise the capital needed. The other point that I was thinking about is I do see the added value for the riders and for the end users, and that I think is the much better reason to do this. Indeed, somebody leaving their house in the morning doesn't do this for the climate or for the CO2 reductions, but he does want to have a swap station as close as possible to their house, or as close as possible to wherever they drop their client. And if that could be an Ampersand or an Arkwright or another swap station, for them it would make their lives a lot easier and therefore also be valuable. Yeah, I think I had another point, I forgot it.
No, at all. So, I mean, on that point, making it easier for the rider, and to the point of maybe a government turns around and says, you know what, I don't want a Rome, an Ampersand, a different charging station on every corner. I want it to be like the petrol stations. I want one place where one organization can go, and the government just puts their foot down on that from a policy perspective to the companies. What happens then?
Well, there isn't one national single petrol station operator, so and there are variances in fuel quality, especially if you go out into rural areas. Look, I mean, if that came down the line, it's just, I think it's instructive to maybe look at this isn't the first time this topic has come up. Exactly the same movie played in India about 7-8 years ago. It chewed up a lot of time, a lot of TA budget, so I think a lot of consultants made a lot of money. But in the end, it's just completely unworkable. You have companies like Piaggio that produce a lot of the tuk-tuks in India, Bajaj and so on. They say, look, if we produce this vehicle and some random company puts in a battery and then it catches fire, who's responsible? What happens with the warranty terms is one issue. And again, the innovation one, I think, though, is the most powerful argument. And we're in a very unique use case here in Africa. It would be like going back to 1910 and saying, okay, wow, it's just so annoying that you've got to get different piston rings for different cars and different carburetors and different parts, so we're going to standardize the car engine in 1910. And we'd all be driving around burning kerosene in funny little, I mean, that might have actually helped to push electric vehicles a lot sooner, because cars would have been so bad. So I think there needs to be free and open competition. I think maybe it's helpful to also back up a step and look at what is the motivation here. A lot of it seems to be coming from lenders who are worried about the asset value of the security. And they should be, because we've got batteries that are supposed to last for 4 years, and suddenly they're all dead after 6 months. Look at companies, look at the battery cohorts. I would urge you, and ask riders, how's the battery working? Does it do as advertised? I think there are other ways to solve some of these concerns. I think there's also a very legitimate consumer protection concern, because there's a fear of a monopoly, right? So if I get a Spiro bike, I get it at very low cost, or I get, say anyone, Ampersand, whatever. Am I then locked into that? So then the next day, the company can turn around and increase the price, and you can't just go down the road. I think so the first step there is, I think there needs to be very clear, like, legal, maybe it's the competition commissions or whatever, to say you cannot stop somebody, and you cannot introduce unreasonable barriers to somebody switching over. I think there is also a lot happening in the sort of convergent evolution. Almost everybody now is using 72 volts. Only Arkwright uses 48, and I believe they're working on that too. Sun Mobility is 48, but I'm not sure if they're going to stick with that, but that's a legacy thing out of India. That's kind of one of the big cost hurdles if you wanted to switch from one to another. Everybody's using the CAN communications protocol. And dimensionally, because of history, because of conventional internal combustion engine motorcycles, the battery packs tend to conform to more or less the same size. There are a couple of giant ones out there, but by and large, you can switch them over. And switching costs is probably, when we've costed it out in the past, it's been between sort of $80 and $130. So not insurmountable. And there are ways to simplify that. But I think that's a one-off choice. You're not going to see a situation where you can get on an Ampersand bike, it's got an eWAKA battery in it, and drop it off at an Arkwright station, and then plug it in at home on a Roam charger. It's just not going to happen. Like, you're dreaming. And frankly, if something came down and pitched, someone said, no, it has to be the same everywhere, we'll just go somewhere else. Honestly, like, they're way lower hanging fruit than dealing with something silly like that.
Do you want to?
Yes, I think maybe it's also a different understanding for interoperability amongst us and perhaps also the audience. I see, I just have 2 sentences to say. I think that interoperability should be at a measurable level made possible, right? Without obstructing innovation. But if you look at it, using the same analogy that Josh used, maybe in 1910, we were having different vehicles, but fast forward today, you could drive into any, or most times, let's say you could drive into a mechanic workshop and they can fix your vehicle to a certain extent, even if they are not the professionals of that make. So we need a minimum, I would say, ability to either, because we are talking of products that have a beginning and an end life cycle. So we need to look at the entire value chain to be able to manage different aspects of it. And something needs to be standardized, right? In a way, maybe standardization is not interoperability, but we need standards that should allow us to be able to manage this. And if possible, go as far as we can to make sure with a little retrofitting also, you could still use products from eWAKA in some other cases, because at the end of the day, even for the investors, once you have those assets, they will need to have a value, a second life value, for example, because if not, you can't evaluate what their I would say, value is after some years?
I forgot what I wanted to say. But, I think interoperability, I think you said it really well, Ray. Is the question is for whom, why, and when? When are we ready for it? Just recently in Europe, the European Union has made the decision to standardize the charging cable for all computers, right, to the Type-C type. When did the first computers come out, right? This is happening now in 2026. Again, the question is, when is a market ready, and when is it desirable for the consumer, right, to standardize? That being said, I think it all depends on the layer, right? You will have standardization or interoperability at battery network level. You can have it at power producers. You can have it at the level of vehicle manufacturers. You can have it, as you said, in terms of like parts, right? Which is probably desirable, especially in a market like Africa, which is a net importing market. And so I think the question of interoperability is one that, again, like with the DRE versus grid discussion, is on what level of that spectrum do you want to put it? And you know, where do you want to impose it, and where should it actually come from the consumer, right? If I look at the fuel stations, because I was trying to think about like an analogy, for example, to having interoperability when it comes to like charging, like as you know was said before, 48 volts, 72 volts, 60 volts. You could have plugs for each one of them. You could standardize at the level of the connectors, like is being done with cars in Europe, right? When you go to a fuel station, even today, you see different products in one place, right? You see petrol, whether it's lead or unlead. You see diesel, right? At the same gas station, you see different producers. So I think that question, again, is a very good conversation to start having, but the timing of it is still kind of far out as far as this market is concerned, where we've just sort of passed that tipping point of like 5% EVs in the market in terms of two-wheelers. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and I think it's great that this is, you know, creating new innovative discussions around how do we tackle that. But to my mind, a little early to talk about standardizing or interoperability in terms of batteries, in terms of BMS, in terms of GPS in the market. That is so new.
So in summary, it's complicated. I am terrible timekeeping on my side. Ray, I also know you need to run, so if you do run. But I do want to just throw it open, because I promised ages ago and then failed to the audience, to see if there is time for just one, maybe two questions from anyone in the audience. Please do. Have we got a mic in the audience somewhere? There's a question just down here at the third row. I think it's on its way. Thank you.
Thank you. That was quite a trip. I'll stand up. My name is Kelly. I'm with Energise. I want to ask a question just to continue the interoperability conversation. Josh has talked about switching costs, but in the context of I'm Kenyan, the Kenya tech energy space has been subject of a lot of experiments, you know, from solar home systems, clean cooking, and now, of course, e-mobility. And as an advisor, of course, we want all the companies to succeed, but not all companies succeed. And what happens then is when they no longer make sense for funders and they have to exit the market, the rural poor are left holding these assets, whether it is solar home systems that no longer work or cookers that they cannot fuel, maybe now motorcycle frames that they can't use. So whose role is it in terms of consumer protection to ensure that the companies that are coming into the market are accountable, because at a point where you're going into liquidation, of course, there is no money to compensate riders to switch to another user. So as much as I appreciate the interoperability and the innovation in the battery, I worry, especially because we are targeting vulnerable youth economically, and of course, some companies will fail, some will succeed. Thank you.
So with motorcycles, about 90% of them are financed by professional finance companies. Sarco's the biggest, Mcopa, and in the case of electric, Mcopa and Watu overall. And so they're the ones, they do exercise a lot of due diligence, and they are obviously very aware of the asset performance. And however, there is definitely this risk that there are going to be a lot of science experiments gone wrong, or there's kind of a dichotomy right in the e-mobility sector. There are companies that are building for quality, so building products that are actually going to last, investing the time and money in getting things right in the R&D. There's a lot of lender pressure to slash R&D budgets to get to profitability as soon as possible. I think that some of the lenders need to chill out. And they also need to understand that they're effectively repeating the same mistakes that cause a lot of damage in the solar home system sector. There's a lot of solar home system PTSD, but they're still repeating the same mistakes. So saying, oh, any old cheap stuff from China, look, it looks fine. The brochure says it's great. The supplier says, oh yeah, it's fantastic. It's totally going to last 10 years. And then how many actually do last that long? And then you get the rollback in the standards and all of that needs to happen. I think investors definitely have a role to play in not backing crappy product and actually doing the homework. There's a job for us to help investors to understand what is it that matters, where are the stress points. But because it isn't easy to do what companies like eWAKA and Ampersand do. On the one hand, you have these fantastic unit economics, right? Because of the utilization rate of the asset, it's far better. It's a fantastic investment on the spreadsheet. But unfortunately, a lot of CIOs sit in foreign capitals and they're only looking at the spreadsheet. But you've got to also understand the lived reality for the customer, what they need, what their financial flows are, what their cash flow, what their cash sensitivity is, and what their priorities are, and just the technical and operational reality, and which is a motorcycle, a relatively large, powerful vehicle. Safety is really important. If you put a little drum brake on the front that couldn't stop a hairdryer, not naming names, but I think you know who I mean, you're gonna hurt people, you're gonna kill people, and people are not gonna want to get on that vehicle. It's an incredible technical challenge to do that and to keep the batteries working reliably long enough over hundreds of thousands of kilometers. It's a Herculean task. It's really not easy. And it's a complex operational management challenge. It's a complex data challenge. And of course, complexity solved equals value. That's a real high value technology there, right? Because you've got a deltas in the amount of capex you need, the reliability, the uptime for relatively small investments on the part of R&D budgets and engineering teams that deliver phenomenal value. Easily, I can name 4 or 5 things that would be enough in a mature energy market to completely outcompete anybody. And these are happening at a pace. So we were very lucky in hindsight to have investors at seed and Series A that really got the technology and understood the value of that, and understood that also just the moral implications of dropping a bunch of crap into a market that wasn't ripe for it. And so I pity companies that have not had that and have had investors say, just get your costs down. We're terrified of fundraising risk. Why are you spending money on these R&D overheads? Just go to China, get something off the shelf. It'll work fine. Yes, there is definitely an acute risk. I think I'm always skeptical that regulation and standards are the solution. But I think I hope there are more efficient solutions. Obviously, if people invest in bad companies, they're going to lose money. But it is perplexing and bizarre to me that out of the whole solar home system mini-grid PTSD, that some of the lessons have still not been learned, and history is repeating itself.
I'm way over. One question. Anyone got one very quick question there? And then this will be the last one, and then I promise we will stop.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Hans Komakesh. My question is, you have all discussed more strongly on the battery systems, but the EVs also have other components that are really important. And I wanted you to reflect on that, but also more importantly, what happens to the afterlife of these EVs? Who is taking care of those batteries that have possibly come out of the systems?
Celeste?
Yeah, so I agree with you. EV is more than just the battery. There is a lot being done by, I think really by most players in this market. I mean, Kenya is pretty crowded when it comes to e-mobility, to develop and bring to market robust vehicles, and because at the end of the day, that is what the rider owns, right? Because one thing that needs to be said when it comes to the disaggregation of the battery from the bike is that you are not the owner of the battery, right? So when the bike needs to be resold after a potential default, what you're getting to buy is basically the vehicle, not the battery, because you never own it, right? So totally agree with you. There needs to be a focus on that, and that's where some of the work on interoperability has actually been very good for the consumer, because a lot of these parts are parts that can be purchased in the market, right? Like they should really be parts that that come from, you know, other bike makers that like Bajaj or Honda or whatever it is, right? The second question about afterlife is also very much on the mind of investors and also of operators like ourselves, right? And again, there's been a need for people to act on across the spectrum, right? And now you do have players that are focusing on the afterlife, especially of batteries, to make sure that you can repurpose these batteries and use them in other sectors, like in, for storage and in, off-grid, or even for home use, right? And that's something that is now coming up, and it's something that I think is being addressed, especially in Kenya, and we're working with one of those and making sure that our batteries are actually repurposed and repacked, and cells are, and you can actually do a lot with the batteries until you get to that point, right? Sometimes just replacing a cell or two. So battery tech, know-how is very important and is being addressed.
Yeah, I'll very, very quickly. So we're currently working with SLS and Cross Boundary. We have an active, we have some of our very first generation of batteries from 7 years ago, past, over 3,500 cycles, still at over 80% of original capacity. They're being used in a mini grid, so yay, let's cross over the Venn diagrams of DRE and e-mobility once over here. And that's working very well. There's a fully amortized for us. Obviously battery costs are coming down. Maybe it's less of a factor for some of the companies, but we take a very small amount up front and have an active a recurring revenue out of that battery, rather than that being a cash and capex burden on the mini grid. Key thing to people thinking of electric cars and vehicles in other contexts, one of the key reasons why almost all of us use LFP is it lasts 3 times longer, right? So reduce, reuse in second life, and then recycle at the very end. And the beauty of, if you get it right, if you build good batteries, if you use good cells, if you look after them, they'll last so long that you will have the problem that you have so few second life batteries to actually prove out this residual value, which is what, until we working with cross-boundary, what we faced.
Quickly, you're standing between them and drinks.
Yeah, just to add very quickly, I mean, Josh has said it all, reuse and recycle, and then what we usually do, depending on the, I know, but reuse and recycle are the two last for ours, but then I want to be quick to mention that also in different countries then where we work, it will be either the duty of GIZ to support the governments to then agree on a policy for recycling of the batteries when they are done at the end of the day, and whether the operators have a role to play or whether we have the industry that should work on it.
Thank you. And with that, and we have more people in here than what we started with. So that is such a win for the end of the second day of a conference. So thank you. And more importantly, thank you to all the wonderful panelists. It was a conversation that went from geopolitics to the last mile consumer to all sorts of things in between, and the election cycles of, you know, some politicians and other bits as well. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you all so much for coming. We much appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy the drinks later.